What if the most important thing a king ever did for his civilization was lose his mind? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but genuinely, catastrophically, and publicly lose it in ways that terrified his court, bewildered his people, and shook the foundations of everything his empire had been built upon. History is obsessed with the kings who were brilliant, the conquerors, the reformers, the builders of empire. We name our children after them. We put their faces on currency. We build museums to hold the things they left behind. But there is another category of ruler, one that history has tried very deliberately to bury. 5 kings across 4,000 years for different civilizations, 5 different varieties of collapse. One declared every god in the world illegal and may have accidentally invented the religious tradition that 3 billion people follow today. One believed he was made of glass, and while he sat in a darkened room afraid to be touched, his empire was handed over to its greatest enemy. One was the most powerful man in the most powerful dynasty on earth, and he spent his reign trying to escape it. One was so broken by his own mind that a doctor took his throne, ran his country for 16 months, and changed the course of Northern European civilization forever. And one was declared insane by psychiatrists who never once looked him in the eye, then found dead in a shallow lake the day after he was deposed. The castles they called his madness? They now draw more than 1 million visitors every year. These are not cautionary tales. They are not case studies in failure. There's something far stranger and far more important than that. These are the stories of 5 kings whose unraveling changed the world, and whom history tried, with extraordinary effort, to forget. It did not succeed. Imagine you are an Egyptian priest in the year 1350 BC. Your family has served the Temple of Amun for 11 generations. Your father served here, his father before him. The religion you protect is not merely a belief system. It is the architecture of reality itself, a vast, intricate, living cosmology that has organized Egyptian civilization for more than 2,000 years. The gods are everywhere, in the river, in the harvest, in the flood that brings life, and the drought that brings death. You know their names, their stories, their hungers, their moods. You have devoted your entire life to understanding and appeasing them. And then one morning, a man, a pharaoh, the living god king of all Egypt, stands up and tells you that every single one of them is illegal. Not misguided, not lesser, not to be subordinated to a new, more powerful deity. Illegal. Gone. All of them. Every god, every temple, every hymn, every priesthood, every ritual that has governed Egyptian life since before the first pyramid was laid. Erased. Overnight. By one man. Acting alone. On the strength of a personal vision. That man was Amenhotep IV. And what he did next set in motion a chain of events so vast, so world-altering, and so deeply strange that we are still, in the most literal sense, living with the consequences today. Before we can understand what Akhenaten broke, we need to understand what Egypt was. By the time Amenhotep IV inherited the throne, sometime around 1353 BC, Egypt was not merely a kingdom. It was the oldest continuously functioning civilization on Earth. Its religious system was not a new institution. It was the accumulated spiritual wisdom of more than 2,000 years of human experience. The pantheon was enormous. Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, Anubis. Each god governed a different domain of existence. Each required specific temples, specific rituals, specific offerings. The priests who maintained these relationships between the divine and the human were among the most powerful people in the country. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, the state's official chief deity, controlled land, wealth, and influence that rivaled the pharaoh himself. This is the world Amenhotep IV was born into. The son of Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most prosperous and politically shrewd rulers. He grew up inside an institution of staggering power and remarkable stability. And almost nothing about him, in his early years, suggested what was coming. What we know of his physical appearance comes almost entirely from his own art, which is where the first strange signals appear. Unlike every pharaoh before him, Amenhotep IV permitted and perhaps demanded that his royal portraits show him in a way that defies every convention of Egyptian royal representation. He is depicted with an elongated skull, a long, thin face, wide hips, a softened physique, full lips, and heavy-lidded eyes. Egyptologists have debated for a century whether this represents a genuine physical condition, a deliberate theological statement about his dual nature as both male and female divinity, or a stylistic revolution in royal portraiture. The debate has not been settled. What is clear is that from the very beginning of his self-presentation, Amenhotep IV was doing something no Egyptian ruler had ever done. He was refusing to look like a pharaoh. But that was just the beginning. In approximately the 5th year of his reign, something shifted. Something decisive, irreversible, and almost impossible to fully explain. Amenhotep IV changed his name. He erased the name Amenhotep and replaced it with Akhenaten, a name that translates, roughly, as he who is effective for the Aten. The Aten was the solar disk, who was a deity with a personality, a mythology, a history. The Aten was the disk itself, the physical, visible, tangible circle of the sun, pure light, pure warmth, the source of all life. And Akhenaten declared that the Aten was not merely the greatest god. It was the only god, the sole divine force in the universe, the source of all creation, all sustenance, all existence. Every other deity, every single one, was a fiction, an illusion, an error to be corrected. He did not just declare this theologically. He acted on it with the full force of pharaonic power. The temples of the old gods were shut. Their statues were defaced. In some cases, their very names were chiseled from stone walls. A particular act of violence in a culture where the erasure of a name was understood as the destruction of soul. The immense wealth of the Temple of Amun, which had been accumulating for centuries, was seized. The priesthood, thousands of men and women whose entire lives had been devoted to the old religion, were dismissed, in some cases persecuted. And then Akhenaten did something that no pharaoh had ever done. He picked up and left. He abandoned Thebes, the ancient capital, the spiritual heartland of Egypt, and built an entirely new city from nothing, in the sand, on land that had never been inhabited. A blank slate, a clean world. He called it Akhetaten. We know it today as Amarna. Amarna is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. Not because of what it contains, but because of what it tells us about the mind that created it. It was built in a frenzy. Akhenaten reportedly marked the boundaries of his new city himself, driving his chariot to the four corners of the chosen site and declaring each edge sacred to the Aten. Construction was rushed. The limestone was cut thin. The buildings were built to a scale and a speed that Egyptian architecture had rarely attempted. Within a few years, a city of perhaps 50,000 people had materialized in the desert. The royal palace, the great temple to the Aten, a vast, roofless structure because the god it honored lived in the open sky and did not require a ceiling. Administrative buildings, workshops, homes for the officials who had no choice but to follow their king into the desert. And at the center of it all, a royal family like no other in Egyptian history. The art of Amarna is haunting in its intimacy. Where traditional Egyptian royal art was formal, hieratic, rigid, designed to communicate power and divine authority, the art of Amarna shows Akhenaten and his wife, the astonishing Nefertiti, sitting with their daughters, playing with them, kissing them, letting the daughters climb on them. The Aten's rays stretched down from above, ending in small human hands that touch the faces of the royal family with what can only be described as tenderness. This is not the art of a conqueror. It is not the art of a tyrant, exactly. It is the art of a man who had built himself a private world and was trying to convince everyone around him that it was paradise. Meanwhile, outside that paradise, the empire was on fire. We know this because of one of the most remarkable archival discoveries in the history of Egyptology. In 1887, a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Amarna found a cache of clay tablets. They turned out to be the diplomatic correspondence of Akhenaten's court. Letters written in cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, between the pharaoh and the rulers of Egypt's vassal states and allied kingdoms. They are known today as the Amarna letters, and they are, if you know how to read them, a portrait of catastrophe. Letter after letter arrives from the kings of Canaan, Byblos, and other Egyptian-controlled territories. The messages share a common theme, stated with increasing desperation across the years of Akhenaten's reign. We are under attack. Send soldiers. We are being overrun by enemies. Where are the Egyptian troops? My city is being taken. My people are dying. Why does the pharaoh not respond? And from the Egyptian side, almost nothing. Akhenaten was in Amarna, composing hymns to the solar disk, watching his daughters play in the palace courtyard, performing elaborate rituals of sunrise worship at a temple with no roof. The greatest diplomatic and military correspondence network in the ancient world was arriving at his door with urgent pleas for military assistance. And the pharaoh was, for reasons we can only speculate about, not responding. Was he disinterested? Incapacitated? So consumed by his religious revolution that the practical work of maintaining an empire seemed, to him, irrelevant? We do not know. The Amarna letters do not tell us what was happening in Akhenaten's mind. They only tell us what was happening to his empire while he was thinking about something else entirely. Cities were lost. Trade routes were disrupted. Vassals who received no protection found protection elsewhere or simply collapsed. Egypt under Akhenaten did not fall, but it frayed. And the fraying happened in plain sight, in clay, pressed with a stylus, dried in the sun, and buried for 3,000 years. Akhenaten died sometime around 1336 BC. The circumstances are unknown. He simply disappears from the historical record. There is no account of a great illness, no dramatic last scene, no monument to his passing. He was there, and then he was not. What happened next is one of the most deliberate acts of historical erasure in the entire ancient world. His immediate successors, including, almost certainly, a young boy we know as Tutankhamun, began the systematic destruction of everything Akhenaten had built and everything he had declared. Amarna was abandoned within a few years of his death. The temples of the old gods were reopened. The wealth flowed back. The statues were repaired. The rituals resumed. And Akhenaten himself was unmade. His name was chiseled from every monument on which it appeared. His images were defaced. His city was stripped for building material and left to the sand. The official list of Egyptian pharaohs, the king list that were the ancient world's version of recorded history, skipped from Amenhotep III directly to the rulers who came after the Amarna period, as if the entire episode had never occurred. Akhenaten was not merely condemned. He was not merely deposed posthumously. He was erased. His name does not appear in any Egyptian source for more than 3,000 years. And Tutankhaten, the boy who succeeded him, changed his own name immediately upon taking the throne. He became Tutankhamun. The restoration of Amun's name in the royal identity was not subtle. It was a declaration. The heresy is over. The old order has returned. They buried Akhenaten so deep and so thoroughly that when archaeologists first began to piece together the story of the Amarna period in the 19th century, they could barely believe what they were finding. An entire chapter of Egyptian history, a chapter that contained a revolution in human religious thought, had been so completely suppressed that its reconstruction required the work of generations of scholars. But here's the thing about ideas. You can chisel a name from stone. You can abandon a city and let the sand reclaim it. You can rewrite the official history of a kingdom and pretend a pharaoh never existed. You cannot do the same thing to a concept. The idea that Akhenaten introduced to the world, however crudely, however coercively, however disastrously in its first iteration, was the idea of a single divine power. One God, universal, invisible in form, but present everywhere. The source of all light, all warmth, all life. Not a god of Egypt specifically, not a tribal deity who favored one people over another. A cosmic force, a universal truth. That idea was 3,500 years old before anyone thought to write it down as the first line of what we now call the Old Testament. The connection between Atenism and the Abrahamic religious tradition is one of the most debated questions in the academic study of religion. Most mainstream historians are careful, rightly careful, about claiming any direct lineage. The evidence is not conclusive. The timeline is contested. The mechanisms of transmission, if any existed, remain speculative. But Sigmund Freud, not a historian, but one of the most penetrating minds of the 20th century, spent some of his final years on this question. His last major work, Moses and Monotheism, published in 1939, argued that Moses himself was an Egyptian, possibly a follower of Akhenaten's religion, who carried the monotheistic tradition out of Egypt and into the Hebrew people. Freud was not writing history. He was writing a provocation, a question dressed up as an argument. Whether or not the connection is literal, what is undeniable is this. Akhenaten articulated, for the first time in recorded human history, the core theological structure that would eventually become Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One God, universal, invisible, all-seeing, the source of all that is. He did not intend to found a world religion. He intended to consolidate his own political power, eliminate the wealth and influence of a rival institution, and build a private city in the desert where he could worship the sun in peace. His revolution was not a gift to humanity. It was, by almost any measure, a disaster. It destabilized Egypt, abandoned allies to conquest, and ended with his complete posthumous destruction. But the idea survived. Stripped of its Egyptian context, freed from the specific political agenda of a specific megalomaniacal pharaoh, the notion of a single, universal divine power traveled, through what pathways we cannot say with certainty, across the ancient world. And 3.5 millennia later, more than half the human beings alive on Earth organized their spiritual lives around a theological framework that the Egyptian king first forced upon his people by having their old gods literally chiseled off their walls. History tried to forget Akhenaten. It destroyed his city. It erased his name. It crossed him off the list of kings as if he had never drawn breath. But it could not unthink his idea. There is a particular kind of human being who is so far ahead of their time, or so far outside it, that their contemporaries have no choice but to destroy them. Not because they were wrong, not even because they were dangerous in the simple sense of the word, but because the world they were trying to build was too different from the world that existed to coexist peacefully with it. Akhenaten was that person. He was, depending on how you look at him, a religious visionary, a political opportunist, a deeply unusual mind operating at the very summit of human power, a man who built a dream city in the desert and watched an empire crack while he stared at the sun. He was all of those things simultaneously, and that is precisely why he could not be allowed to exist in the official memory of Egypt. A pharaoh who conquered was useful. A pharaoh who built was admirable. A pharaoh who traded skillfully, who made alliances, who maintained the divine order. These were pharaohs you could honor. A pharaoh who turned the entire architecture of reality upside down for 17 years and then died quietly, leaving the world he had shattered to be reassembled by the people he had tried to destroy. That pharaoh was not to be honored. He was not to be remembered. He was not, if the priests and the bureaucrats and the restorers of the old order had their way, to have ever existed. They almost succeeded. Almost. The priests buried him so deep they thought the world would forget. They were wrong. There is a particular terror that belongs exclusively to people who hold absolute power. It is not the terror of losing a battle. It is not the terror of a rival kingdom massing at the border. It is not even the terror of assassination, though that fear lived in the shadow of every medieval throne. It is the terror of losing the one thing that no army can protect, no treaty can secure, and no amount of gold can buy back once it is gone. The mind. And what happens to a civilization when the man at the very center of its power, the single human being upon whom every decision, every law, Every act of governance ultimately depends. What happens when that man's mind simply begins to leave him? Not all at once. That would almost be merciful. Slowly, in waves, coming and going, leaving him lucid enough on his better days to understand what he was losing, and lost enough on his worst days to be capable of almost anything. France found out the answer to that question in the summer of 1392, and the answer nearly destroyed it. To understand what France lost when Charles VI lost himself, you first have to understand what France believed it had found. When Charles inherited the French crown in 1380, he was 11 years old, a child king, which was hardly unusual for medieval Europe. France had seen child kings before and survived them. The kingdom was placed in the capable, if self-interested, hands of his royal uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon, who governed as regents and helped themselves liberally to the royal treasury in the process. But when Charles came of age and took personal control of his government in 1388, something unexpected happened. He was good at it. He dismissed his uncles from power, a bold move that required considerable political courage for a young man in his early 20s, and surrounded himself with a group of capable, reform-minded advisors his court called the Marmozettes. Under their guidance, and under Charles's own energetic direction, France experienced a brief, genuinely promising period of intelligent governance. Taxes were reformed. Justice was administered more fairly. The court became, for a moment, something approaching functional. The French people noticed. They named him Charles the Well-Beloved, not with the kind of compulsory flattery that royal epithets often carried, but with something that felt, at least in its early years, like genuine warmth. He was young. He was handsome. He was energetic on the battlefield, personally leading military campaigns with the kind of physical courage that medieval France expected and admired in its kings. He had married Isabeau of Bavaria at 17, and together they had produced children. The succession looked secure. The kingdom looked stable. France, for a brief and fragile moment, seemed to be in good hands. That moment lasted 4 years. The summer of 1392 began with a political crisis that was, by the standards of medieval French politics, relatively routine. Olivier de Clisson, the Constable of France and one of Charles's most trusted advisors, had survived an assassination attempt. Evidence pointed to Pierre de Craon, a disgraced nobleman who had fled to the protection of John IV, Duke of Brittany. Charles, loyal to his advisor and furious at the affront, decided to lead a military expedition into Brittany to demand justice. It was hot. The summer of 1392 was punishingly, relentlessly hot across northern France. The army moved slowly through the dust and the heat. The king was already unwell. He had suffered what contemporaries described as a fever in the weeks before the campaign, a fever serious enough that some in his court had quietly wondered whether he would recover. He had recovered, or seemed to have recovered. On the first day of August, 1392, the royal army was passing through the forest of Le Mans. The heat was brutal. The column was moving through the trees when a barefoot man, described in contemporary accounts as disheveled, possibly deranged, ran out of the forest and seized the bridle of the king's horse. "Turn back, noble king," he reportedly shouted. "You are betrayed." The man was chased away by the royal guards. The column continued. The king continued to ride. And then, a short time later, a page riding near the king accidentally allowed 2 lances to clatter together, producing a sudden, sharp, metallic sound in the hot, still air of the forest. Charles VI drew his sword, and then he began to kill his own men. What followed in those moments in the forest of Le Mans was not a battle. It was not a calculated act of royal violence, not a punishment, not a political execution. It was a psychotic break. The first of what would eventually become approximately 44 recorded episodes over the remaining 30 years of his reign. Charles rode through his own men, sword drawn, striking at anyone in reach. By the time the men around him managed to restrain him, a terrifying task, because striking a king, even to protect him, was an act that carried enormous legal and spiritual peril. Several knights were dead or seriously wounded. Contemporary accounts describe the king as frothing, as unseeing, as unaware of where he was or who the people around him were. He did not recognize his own brother. When he was finally subdued and brought to a halt, he had lapsed into an unresponsive state. He did not speak. He lay in the care of his attendants for days, somewhere between consciousness and absence, while the court around him descended into something close to controlled panic. What had happened to the King of France? Medieval medicine had no language adequate to what Charles VI was experiencing. The physicians who attended him, learned men by the standards of their time, trained in the humoral theory of Galen and Hippocrates, concluded that the king had suffered an excess of black bile. That melancholy, in the ancient medical sense of the word, had overwhelmed his constitution. They prescribed purgatives. They bled him. They prayed. They brought in astrologers, then sorcerers, then a team of Augustinian monks who performed elaborate rituals of spiritual purification over the royal body. Nothing worked, because nothing they were doing addressed what was actually happening. What Charles VI was experiencing. And this is where we must be careful, speaking across 600 years of medical history, but also honest about what the evidence suggests, bore the hallmarks of what we would now recognize as a severe psychotic disorder. Possibly schizophrenia. Possibly a bipolar condition with psychotic features. The pattern of his episodes, their cyclical nature, their relationship to stress, their periods of partial or complete remission followed by fresh collapse, fits a clinical picture that modern psychiatry would recognize immediately, even if it cannot diagnose definitively across the centuries. He would recover, partially, enough to resume some functions of kingship for weeks or months at a time. And then the darkness would return. Each time, it seemed to take a little more of him with it when it went. But of all the symptoms that Charles's illness produced across 3 decades, the periods of violence, the failures of recognition, the stretches of near total incapacity, the one that history has found most impossible to forget is the one that gives this chapter its name. The glass delusion. At some point in the progression of his illness, the exact timing is difficult to establish, as different sources place it at different moments in his reign. Charles VI became convinced that he was made of glass. Not metaphorically, not in a poetic or spiritual sense. Literally, physically, the King of France believed that his body was composed of glass, and that if another person were to touch him, he would shatter. He would not allow people near him. He would not permit himself to be embraced. He reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothing and into his bedding, not to harm himself, but to provide a protective armature around his glass body, a framework that would prevent him from breaking if he fell or was jostled. He moved carefully. He sat carefully. He existed, during these episodes, in a state of constant, quiet terror, not of external enemies, not of political rivals, not of the great powers arraying themselves against France's borders, of contact, of the ordinary, human, unavoidable fact of being touched. The king who had once ridden into battle. The king who had embraced his people, who had clasped the hands of allies and enemies alike with the easy physicality of a confident young ruler. That man now sat alone in a darkened room, dressed in protective iron, afraid that a single human touch would reduce him to fragments on the floor. We should sit with this image for a moment, not because it is grotesque, though it is heartbreaking, but because it is, in a very precise way, a portrait of what power feels like when it collapses entirely from the inside. Glass is transparent. You can see through it. It reveals what is behind it. A man who believes he is made of glass is a man who believes he has no substance left, no opacity, no protective density between himself and the world. He is all exposure, all fragility, all the terrible vulnerability of thing that looks solid, but is one sharp impact away from being nothing but sharp pieces on the ground. This was not merely a delusion. It was a psychological statement of extraordinary precision about the experience of being Charles VI, and he was not alone in experiencing it. The glass delusion was recorded in several other European figures across the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, including the philosopher René Descartes, who reportedly feared a version of it, and a Spanish nobleman named Cristobal who believed the same thing. It appears to have been a culturally specific form of psychotic episode, more common in an era when glass was newly precious, newly fragile, newly fascinating as a substance. It was not random. It was, in its own terrible way, a product of its time and its world. But no glass delusion in history had the consequences of Charles VI. Because Charles VI was not a philosopher. He was not a nobleman. He was the king of France. And France could not afford for its king to be made of glass. In a vacuum of a functioning king, the great aristocratic families of France did what great aristocratic families have always done when power is unguarded. They reached for it. Two factions emerged, with a speed and a savagery that tells you everything you need to know about how thin the varnish of court civility actually was. On one side, the Armagnacs, supporters of the House of Valois, led by Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, and championing Charles's brother Louis, Duke of Orleans. On the other side, the Burgundians, supporters of the House of Valois-Burgundy, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, whose claim to influence rested on his position as the king's first cousin and, in his own assessment, his most natural regent. These two factions did not compete politely. In 1407, Burgundian assassins murdered Louis of Orleans in the streets of Paris, stabbing him to death in a dark alley while he returned home from visiting the Queen. John the Fearless initially denied involvement, then, remarkably, admitted it and argued publicly that the assassination was a justified act of tyrannicide against a man whose influence over the king had become corrupt and dangerous. France did not descend into civil war. France was civil war. The streets of Paris became a battlefield between Armagnac and Burgundian partisans. Massacres were committed. Nobles were executed. Political allegiances shifted with a speed that made any coherent governance nearly impossible. The machinery of the French state, which depended on a functioning king at its center, was grinding itself to pieces. And at the center of this chaos, sometimes lucid, sometimes not, sometimes present in his council chamber, and sometimes locked in a darkened room in his iron-reinforced clothing, was Charles VI, the well-beloved, watching his kingdom tear itself apart, and, on his worst days, not understanding clearly enough to be fully afraid of what he was seeing. Into this chaos stepped the most consequential opportunist in the history of medieval warfare, Henry V of England. Henry was 26 years old when he became king. He was disciplined, intelligent, coldly strategic, and possessed of a political ambition that was perfectly calibrated to the specific weakness of his neighbor across the channel. He had a dynastic claim to the French throne. English kings have been arguing about that claim, in various forms, for nearly a century. Under normal circumstances, such a claim was a negotiating position, a diplomatic lever, a theoretical ambition that the practical reality of French military and political strength kept firmly theoretical. But these were not normal circumstances. In October of 1415, Henry led an English army to a field near the village of Agincourt. The French army that met him was larger, better armored, and fighting on its own soil. It was also, thanks to the factional chaos of the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, poorly coordinated, inadequately led, and catastrophically overconfident. The Battle of Agincourt lasted approximately 3 hours. At the end of it, the French nobility lay in the mud, literally, because it had rained heavily and the field was a swamp, in numbers that remained staggering even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers were killed. English casualties were in the hundreds. France was not merely defeated. It was humiliated. Its aristocracy was decimated. Its military confidence was shattered. And its king, back in Paris, had no reliable understanding of what had just happened. Henry pressed his advantage with the systematic patience of a man who understood that he was dealing not with a hostile king, but with an empty throne waiting to be claimed. He campaigned through Normandy. He captured city after city. He negotiated not with Charles, but with the factions around Charles, primarily with the Burgundians, who, in their hatred of the Armagnacs, were willing to make common cause with England against their own countrymen. And then, in May of 1420, the unthinkable happened. At Troyes, Charles VI, in what appears to have been a period of relative lucidity, surrounded by Burgundian advisors and the influence of his own wife Isabeau, who had her own complex reasons for what she was about to do, signed a treaty. The Treaty of Troyes. It declared that Henry V of England would become regent of France during Charles's lifetime, and that upon Charles's death, the French crown would pass not to the Dauphin, not to Charles's own son, the future Charles VII, but to Henry and to Henry's heirs forever. Charles VI, with his own hand, signed away the kingdom of France. His son was disinherited. His dynasty was legally extinguished. The kingdom that French kings had built and defended for 500 years was handed to an Englishman. The document was signed by a man who had, over the preceding 28 years, spent large portions of his reign not knowing his own name. Whether he fully understood what he was signing in May of 1420, whether he was manipulated, whether Isabeau of Bavaria made a calculated political decision to trade her son's inheritance for personal security. These questions have occupied historians for 6 centuries and have not been definitively resolved. What is clear is this. The most consequential political act of Charles VI's 32-year reign was the act that destroyed everything his dynasty had built, and he may not have fully understood he was doing it. Henry V died in 1422. 2 months later, in October of the same year, Charles VI died as well. He had outlasted the man who had conquered him by exactly 57 days. They buried Charles in the royal basilica of Saint Denis, where the kings of France had been interred for generations. But France, the France that the Treaty of Troyes had created, was not the France of his ancestors. Officially, legally, it was now an Anglo-French dual monarchy, governed in Charles's name and then in the name of the infant English king Henry VI. The Dauphin, Charles VI's disinherited son, the young man who would later become Charles VII, retreated south of the Loire River and governed a rump kingdom that the Burgundian-controlled Paris court dismissed with contempt. They called him the Little King of Bourges. He had no money, no reliable army, no clear political strategy, and increasingly, no obvious reason for hope. France, as it had existed, was effectively over, and yet, it is one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of Western civilization, and it emerged not from a general, not from a statesman, not from a diplomatic masterstroke or a military innovation. It emerged from a teenage girl who heard voices. Joan of Arc was born in the village of Domremy in the Lorraine region of northeastern France, probably around 1412. She was the daughter of a farmer. She had no military training, no political connections, no formal education in the strategies of warfare or the mechanics of medieval governance. She had, by her own account, a direct line of communication with Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who had charged her with a specific and audacious mission: drive the English out of France and see that the Dauphin was crowned king. What happened next? The way this young woman managed to present herself to the Dauphin's court, to convince his advisors, to be granted command of a French military force, to relieve the siege of Orleans, to lead the army northward to Reims, where Charles VII was crowned king of France in July of 1429, is one of the most astonishing stories in all of recorded history. And it has been told many times, and told well. But here is the piece of the story that tends to get lost in Joan's extraordinary personal narrative. Joan of Arc was not simply a military phenomenon. She was a psychological one. What she gave to France was not primarily tactical brilliance, though she displayed that as well. What she gave to France was something that no amount of military planning or diplomatic maneuvering could have manufactured. She gave a story about who France was. A story in which France was not a broken kingdom, squabbling over the scraps of its own civil war, while an English king helped himself to the silverware. She gave France a story in which it was a sacred nation, under divine protection, with a legitimate king whose crown was the will of God. That story was only possible because the 30 years of Charles VI's illness had created a specific kind of crisis. Not just military, not just political, existential. France needed to know what it was, whether it still existed, whether there was still something worth fighting for. Joan answered that question with a clarity and a force that the most sophisticated political theorists in Europe could not have manufactured with decades of deliberation. She believed it absolutely. And because she believed it absolutely, France believed it. The English were pushed back. Not immediately. Not without tremendous further cost. Joan herself was captured by the Burgundians in 1430, sold to the English, tried by an ecclesiastical court for heresy and witchcraft, and burned at the stake at Rouen in 1431. She was 19 years old, but the story she had told could not be burned. Charles VII continued the war. Burgundy, eventually, made peace with France. The English were systematically expelled. By 1453, the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had formally begun in 1337, was effectively over. France had survived. It was not the France of Philip II or Louis IX. It was something newer, stranger, and more powerful than either. It was a nation, not merely a kingdom. A people who understood themselves for the first time as French, as something with a shared identity and a shared story and a shared destiny. Joan of Arc had given them that understanding in 1429. But the conditions that made her possible, that made France desperate enough to listen to a teenage farm girl with no credentials except absolute conviction. Those conditions were created across 30 years of a king's disintegration. Charles VI did not make Joan of Arc. But without his catastrophic, generation-long unraveling, the France that needed her would not have existed. And the France that emerged from his reign, forged in the specific fire of his failure, his treaty, his civil war, his abandoned son, his English successors, was a France that had discovered, in the crucible of its worst crisis, what it actually was. They buried Charles VI in St. Denis. They wrote the epitaph of a king whose reign they could not fully explain and did not entirely want to remember. He had been beloved, then broken, then manipulated, then erased in everything but name by the forces that swirled through the vacuum his illness had created. He had signed a treaty that disinherited his own son and handed France to England. He had lived through 30 years of receding selfhood, of moments where he did not know who he was, or where he was, or who the people around him were, of days when he could not bear to be touched, and wore iron in his clothes, and moved through his palace like a man walking on ice. He had been, for the last 3 decades of his life, the most consequential absent person in Europe. And in his absence, France had found itself. There is something in the story of Charles VI that resists the simple consolation of historical hindsight. We can say, and we have said, that Joan of Arc emerged from the chaos of his reign. We can trace the lines from his collapse to the birth of French national consciousness, and those lines are real. But there were also the thousands of people who died at Agincourt, the families destroyed by the civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, the villages burned and the commerce strangled and the ordinary lives shattered by decades of political dysfunction at the very center of the French state. History is not a story in which suffering is automatically redeemed by its consequences. The consequences were real. So was the suffering. Charles VI was not a villain. He was not a fool. He was a man who was genuinely, deeply unwell in a world that had no conceptual framework for what was happening to him, surrounded by people whose primary response to his incapacity was to use it. He deserved better than what he got. So did France. But France, in the end, survived, and more than survived. The kingdom that staggered out of the wreckage of Charles VI's reign, the kingdom that Joan had electrified and Charles VII had slowly, painfully reconstructed, was harder, more self-aware, and more conscious of its own identity than the comfortable, prosperous France that Charles VI had inherited as a young man in 1380. The iron, in the end, was not in the king's clothes. It was in the nation he had inadvertently forged. He believed he was made of glass. France, it turned out, was made of something far stronger. There's a question that no institution of absolute power has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. What do you do when a man at the top refuses to be the man at the top? Not through weakness, not through cowardice, not because he lacks the intelligence or the will or the physical capability to govern, but because he looks at the throne, that supreme, terrifying, lonely pinnacle of human authority, and feels, with every fiber of his being, not ambition, not pride, not the solemn weight of destiny. He feels trapped. What do you do with an emperor who does not want to be an emperor? What happens to a civilization built entirely around the performance of imperial power when the performer simply refuses to perform? China found out the answer to that question in the early 16th century. And the answer was so strange, so genuinely unprecedented, and so fundamentally human that it defies every category we normally use to understand the rulers of great empires. Because this emperor did not lose his mind. He did not suffer a breakdown. He did not descend into paranoia or cruelty or the particular darkness that absolute power, unchecked, so often produces. He simply, stubbornly, joyfully, and at enormous personal risk, decided to be free. In that decision, that single sustained, lifelong act of imperial self-liberation, shook the most powerful dynasty in the world to its foundations. To understand the Zhengde Emperor, you first have to understand the cage. The Ming dynasty, at the dawn of the 16th century, was the most powerful political institution on earth. It governed a population of somewhere between 60 and 80 million people. Its capital, Beijing, was a city of extraordinary scale and sophistication, anchored by the Forbidden City, a palace complex of 9,999 rooms, enclosed behind walls 50 feet high, surrounded by a moat 170 feet wide, and designed according to cosmological principles so precise and so elaborate that the architecture itself was a statement about the divine order of the universe. The Son of Heaven, the Emperor, lived at the center of this structure. Literally, the Forbidden City was built on the central axis of Beijing, which was itself understood as the central axis of the civilized world. The emperor sat at the absolute geographic and metaphysical heart of everything. And he could not leave. Not really. Not freely. Not the way an ordinary man leaves a building and walks out into the world and does whatever he likes. The emperor's movements were governed by ritual. His daily schedule was prescribed by centuries of precedent. His meals, his clothing, his sleeping arrangements, his interactions with other human beings. Every aspect of his physical existence was choreographed by an institution of extraordinary precision. The eunuchs who staffed the palace were themselves an institution within an institution, a vast, internally hierarchical bureaucratic body that managed the emperor's domestic life down to the smallest detail, and, in doing so, effectively managed the emperor. The emperor was, in the most fundamental sense, a symbol, the living embodiment of heaven's mandate to govern the earth. His role was to perform this embodiment with absolute correctness, to conduct the proper rituals at the proper times, to receive the proper officials in the proper sequence, to issue edicts in the proper form, to be precisely, perfectly, and entirely the institution that the institution required him to be. He was not supposed to have opinions about this. He was not supposed to have preferences that contradicted it. He was certainly not supposed to find it, on reflection, completely and utterly insufferable. And then, in the year 1505, a 15-year-old boy named Zhu Hozhao sat down on the dragon throne. And everything the Ming institution thought it understood about how an emperor worked turned out to be wrong. Zhu Hozhao had not been raised to be emperor. He was the second son of the Hongzhi emperor, one of the most conscientious and genuinely admired rulers in Ming history, a man famous for his personal devotion to Confucian values and his monogamous marriage, extraordinary for an emperor. The elder brother had died young, making Zhu Hozhao the heir. He was, by all accounts, a boy of startling intelligence and an equally startling restlessness. He learned quickly. He was curious about almost everything. He had a gift for languages. He would later demonstrate fluency in Mongolian, Tibetan, and reportedly several other languages beyond his native Mandarin, and a physical energy that the confined rituals of imperial education could barely contain. What we do not know, and cannot know with certainty, is what Zhu Hozhao felt in those early years at the center of the Forbidden City's machinery. The historical record is filtered almost entirely through the memorials of Confucian officials who disapproved of him profoundly and documented his behavior with a mixture of horror and barely concealed contempt. We see him through the eyes of men who had a very specific idea of what an emperor should be and an equally specific horror at the discovery that this particular emperor had no interest in being it. What we can say is this. Within a very short time of taking the throne and receiving the reign title Zhengde, meaning rectification of virtue, which would turn out to be one of history's more ironic choices of imperial motto, the young emperor began to exhibit behavior that threw the entire Ming court into a state of sustained, low-grade institutional panic. He stayed up all night. He explored the outer reaches of the forbidden city that protocol said he had no business visiting. He collected animals. He invited performers, musicians, and merchants into the palace precincts in direct violation of the ritual boundaries that were supposed to separate the sacred imperial space from the ordinary human world outside it. He spent hours, then days, in a section of the palace complex that his eunuchs had converted for him into a kind of personal marketplace. Stalls, traders, acrobats, exotic goods from across Asia. He called it his bazaar. He wandered through it like a man who had been released from a very long confinement and could not stop touching everything. He was 16 years old. He was the most powerful human being in the world. And what he wanted, more than anything the most powerful human being in the world could theoretically command, was to be somewhere else. The Confucian officials who staffed the Ming bureaucracy were not stupid men. They understood, with a clarity that was also a kind of dread, what was happening. An emperor who did not perform his institutional role was not merely an inconvenience. He was a cosmological problem. The son of heaven's proper conduct was understood as directly connected to the harmony of the universe, to the regularity of the seasons, to the prosperity of the harvest, to the stability of the social order. An emperor who spent his nights playing in a private marketplace and refused to attend the morning court audiences was not just shirking his duties. He was, in the most literal sense his civilization could construct, disrupting the order of heaven and earth. They memorialized him, relentlessly. A memorial in the Ming system was a formal written remonstrance, a document submitted by an official to the emperor, often at considerable personal risk, stating plainly that the emperor was doing something wrong and needed to stop. Hundreds of memorials were submitted to the Zhengde emperor over the course of his reign. They urged him to attend to his duties. They warned him of the cosmic consequences of his behavior. They cited precedents from the classical texts. They appealed to his filial duty to his ancestors. They threatened, in the carefully coded language of Confucian officialdom, that his conduct was bringing disorder to the realm. Zhengde read these memorials, or had them read to him, and then did precisely what he had been doing before. He had officials who submitted particularly persistent memorials beaten with bamboo rods in the palace courtyard, a punishment known as the court beating, which was technically legal, frequently humiliating, and occasionally fatal. This was not, by Ming standards, an unusual response to official impertinence. But Zhengde deployed it with a frequency and an enthusiasm that suggests he found the exercise as much personally satisfying as politically necessary. He was not a cruel man by the evidence of his broader conduct. He was an impatient one, and the institution arrayed against him, the vast, ancient, deeply entrenched apparatus of Confucian bureaucratic governance, was not something that beatings, however enthusiastic, could fundamentally alter. So the Zhengde emperor tried something else. He tried to escape it entirely. What followed across the 16 years of the Zhengde emperor's reign is one of the most extraordinary sustained acts of imperial self-reinvention in the history of any civilization. He began with the military. Zhengde was fascinated by soldiers. Not in the abstract way that emperors were supposed to be interested in military affairs, as administrators of campaigns, as signatories of treaties, as the ultimate authority over forces they never personally commanded in the field. He wanted to be a soldier. Actually, physically, concretely a soldier. He wanted to wear armor and ride in a battle and feel the experience that the system had decided an emperor should never feel because emperors were too valuable and too sacred and too symbolically important to risk in actual combat. He gave himself military ranks. He devised a personal military identity, an alter ego, essentially, under the name Zhu Shou, through which he could interact with the military world as something closer to an ordinary commander rather than as the son of heaven. He drilled troops. He studied weapons. He reportedly had a genuine gift for horsemanship and a physical courage that his commanders, whatever they thought of his imperial conduct, acknowledged with reluctant respect. And in 1517, on the northern frontier near the town of Yingzhou, the Zhengde emperor got what he had been looking for. A real battle. A Mongol raiding force under the leader, known as the Prince of the Small King, crossed the northern border. Zhengde, who had traveled to the frontier on one of his extended departures from Beijing over the furious objections of his entire court, was there. He personally participated in the engagement. The battle was real. The danger was real. Men died around him. The Ming forces repulsed the Mongol incursion. And Zhengde, in his after-action report, which he composed himself, as his own general, under his own invented military persona, credited the victory to the inspired leadership of the commander Zhu Shou. He was writing fan fiction about himself. In an official imperial military dispatch, the court's response to this document has not been preserved in explicit detail, but one imagines it landing in the bureaucratic offices of Beijing with the impact of a stone dropped into a very still pond. But the military adventures were only one dimension of the Zhengde emperor's sustained campaign of self-liberation. His interests were genuinely, almost bewilderingly diverse. He was drawn to Islam with an intensity that went well beyond the casual curiosity an emperor might be expected to show toward a religious tradition practiced by significant communities within his empire. He learned Arabic. He forbade the consumption of pork at court, a prohibition with obvious Islamic resonance that horrified his Confucian officials, who saw it as both religiously inappropriate and symbolically dangerous. He surrounded himself with Muslim advisors, Muslim musicians, and Muslim merchants. Some historical sources suggest he underwent something approaching a formal conversion, though this remains debated. What is not debated is that his interest in Islamic culture was genuine, sustained, and personal rather than merely political. He was equally fascinated by Tibetan Buddhism, by the theatrical and musical traditions of Central and Western Asia, by the practices and customs of peoples his predecessors had governed from a distance of polite administrative remove. He did not want to govern these peoples. He wanted to know them, to spend time with them, to speak their languages and eat their food and understand how they understood the world. Inside the Forbidden City, he built what contemporaries described as a pleasure complex of remarkable scale, a series of interconnected spaces that contained animals, including tigers that he reportedly engaged with personally, which was either an act of extraordinary courage or an illustration of how thoroughly he had departed from any conventional understanding of what emperors were supposed to do with their time. He played music. He composed music. He drank, by the accounts of disapproving officials, rather more than was decorous. He kept company with people whose social standing in the Confucian hierarchy made his officials' hair stand on end. Merchants, entertainers, eunuchs he had elevated to positions of trust and influence far beyond what protocol permitted. He was, in the most precise and accurate sense of the phrase, living his life. Loudly, unrepentantly, at the center of the most ritual-bound institution in the world. And the institution ground its teeth and issued memorials and administered beatings and could not stop him. Because he was the Son of Heaven, and the same system that demanded his conformity also made it structurally nearly impossible to compel it. In 1520, the tension that had been building throughout Zhengde's reign produced its most dramatic rupture. A prince named Zhu Qinhao, the Prince of Ning, a descendant of the Ming royal house who had spent years cultivating a regional power base in the Jiangxi province, launched a full-scale armed rebellion against the emperor. By the standards of Ming dynastic politics, this was a serious matter. Zhu Qinhao had resources, supporters, and a coherent political argument, namely, that Zhengde's conduct had forfeited the mandate of heaven and that a more properly governed Ming ruler should take his place. The rebellion had to be suppressed. The dynasty's survival required it. The court's response was to mobilize military forces and send them toward Jiangxi. Officials in the affected regions began to coordinate resistance. The machinery of Ming imperial governance, when it came to genuine existential threats, was capable of operating with considerable efficiency. And Zhengde's response? He was delighted. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor as genuinely, unambiguously excited by the news of the rebellion. Not because he welcomed a threat to his throne, but because a rebellion meant a military campaign. A genuine military campaign with real stakes that he could personally lead under his military alter ego, finally doing the thing he had always wanted to do in circumstances that would give the results actual meaning. He immediately began preparations to lead the suppression personally. He issued orders in his capacity as the great commander Zhu Shou. He began moving south. There was only one problem. By the time Zhengde arrived anywhere near the theater of operations, his own officials had already crushed the rebellion. The Prince of Ning had been captured. The military engagement the emperor had been racing toward was over before he got there. His response to this development has passed into historical legend, and it is so perfectly characteristic of the Zhengde emperor that even accounts filtered through the disapproving prose of Confucian historians cannot entirely suppress the darkly comic quality of what happened next. He reportedly ordered that the captured Prince of Ning be released. Not pardoned, not tried, not executed, which was the fate that awaited him. Released, back into the field, so that the rebellion could continue, so that there was still something for the great commander Zhu Shou to defeat. Whether this actually happened, or whether it is an embellishment by historians who found in Zhengde a figure too extraordinary to leave unembellished, cannot be established with certainty. The Prince of Ning was, in the end, not released. He was tried and executed. Justice, in the conventional sense, was done. But the story, whether it is literally true or an exaggeration of something true, which is often how legend works, captures something essential about who the Zhengde emperor was. He was a man for whom the most serious political crisis of his reign was, first and most powerfully, an opportunity, an adventure, a chance to finally be the person he had always wanted to be, in circumstances that the institution he was born into had spent 16 years conspiring to deny him. He did not see the rebellion as a threat. He saw it as an invitation, and that, perhaps more than anything else about him, tells you what the Forbidden City had felt like from the inside. The Zhengde emperor did not die dramatically. He did not die in battle, which he would probably have preferred. He did not die of a broken mind or a shattered constitution. He died of something almost mundanely human. In the autumn of 1520, returning north from his southern campaign, he fell from a boat on the Qingjiang River while fishing. The fall itself was not immediately fatal, but the emperor was soaked through, the weather was cold, and whatever physical damage or illness the incident produced compounded over the following months. He died in April of 1521. He was 29 years old. He left no heir. He had, in between his military adventures and his linguistic enthusiasms and his bazaars and his tiger encounters and his elaborate personal mythology, apparently neglected to father a son. This was not, by the standards of Ming imperial expectation, a minor oversight. It was a dynastic crisis of the first order. With no direct heir, the succession could not follow the normal pattern. The court, the officials, the eunuchs, the Empress Dowager, was forced to look outside the direct line of descent. After deliberation, the choice fell on a cousin of Zhengde's, a young man from a collateral branch of the Ming royal family, who took the throne as the Jiajing emperor. The transition from Zhengde to Jiajing was not merely a change of personnel. It was a change of philosophy so complete that it amounted to a repudiation of everything the previous 16 years had represented. Jiajing was everything Zhengde was not. Deeply committed to Confucian orthodoxy, intensely focused on ritual propriety, distrustful of eunuch influence, suspicious of external cultural intrusions, devoted to the correct performance of imperial ceremony with a seriousness that bordered, by some accounts, on obsession. He spent enormous energy reconstructing the ritual architecture of Ming imperial governance that Zhengde had treated with such magnificent disregard. He was, in other words, precisely what the Confucian bureaucracy had always wanted. The emperor, the institution, had designed the institution to produce. And yet, the Jiajing emperor's obsessive reconstruction of Confucian imperial correctness carried within it the seeds of a different kind of danger. In tightening the system, in reasserting the ritual boundaries, reinforcing the bureaucratic hierarchies, closing the apertures of freedom and flexibility that Zhengde's chaotic reign had pried open, the Ming dynasty was also making itself less adaptable, less capable of the kind of pragmatic responsiveness that an empire governing tens of millions of people across an enormous geographic territory actually requires. Zhengde's reign, for all its chaos, had been genuinely adaptive. He had engaged with Islamic traders and Mongol commanders and Tibetan monks and the full diversity of the world his dynasty governed, not through the mediated distance of bureaucratic report, but through direct, personal, curious contact. He had understood things about the edges of his empire that no official memorial could fully convey, because he had gone to those edges and talked to the people there in their own languages about things that interested them both. The Ming institution looked at this and saw disorder. Undignified disorder, cosmic disorder, the kind of disorder that their entire cosmological framework told them was dangerous and wrong. What they could not see, what the framework they were using to evaluate his reign prevented them from seeing, was that Zhengde had, in his spectacularly unorthodox way, been doing something that emperors were supposed to do. He had been learning, growing, engaging with the world his dynasty governed as it actually was rather than as the classical text said it should be. When Jiajing closed those apertures, when the dynasty pulled back behind its ritual walls and concentrated on performing its own correctness, it sacrificed something it would not fully understand it had lost until much later. The Ming dynasty fell in 1644. The causes were multiple and complex: economic strain, peasant rebellion, military pressure from the Manchu people to the north who had established the Qing dynasty in its place. No single reign can bear the full weight of a dynasty's ultimate collapse. But historians of the late Ming period have traced, with considerable care and persuasiveness, the connection between the rigidity that set into the dynasty after the Zhengde period and the institutional brittleness that made it unable to adapt to the crises of the 17th century. The tightening that began under Jiajing, that deliberate, anxious reconstruction of imperial orthodoxy in response to the trauma of Zhengde's chaos, produced an institution that became progressively less capable of the flexibility that survival required. Zhengde had been a warning the dynasty chose to read as a problem to be corrected rather than a signal to be understood. The correction, in the long run, cost more than the problem. The Zhengde emperor sits in an unusual position in the historical memory of China. He is not celebrated. The Confucian tradition that dominated Chinese historical writing for centuries had no framework in which to cast him as a hero, because the things he did that were genuinely admirable, his curiosity, his courage, his linguistic gifts, his refusal to govern through the mediated unreality of bureaucratic report, were inseparable from the behaviors that the same tradition found most objectionable. You could not praise his intellectual range without acknowledging that he acquired it by abandoning his court. You could not admire his military courage without confronting the fact that he expressed it by inventing an alter ego and writing dispatches about himself in the third person. He was not, in the ways that Chinese imperial historiography recognized and rewarded, a good emperor. He did not govern with Confucian rectitude. He did not maintain the proper distances. He did not perform the institution with the devotion it required. But he was something that the institution had almost no experience producing and absolutely no mechanism for accommodating. He was a complete human being, a man with enthusiasms and curiosities and languages and adventures and a sense of humor dark enough to order a rebel released so he could fight him himself. A man who looked at the most elaborate cage ever built for a human being and spent 16 years rattling every bar he could reach, not from rage, not from madness, but from an entirely comprehensible, entirely human desire to live his actual life rather than the performance of one. The institution won in the end. It always wins in the end. Zhu Hozhao died at 29, leaving no heir, leaving chaos in his wake. And the institution that survived him quickly, efficiently, and rather pointedly went about constructing the most orthodox possible version of itself in reaction to everything he had been. But Zhu Hozhao had also lived, really lived, in a way that the Dragon Throne was specifically designed to prevent. He had spoken Mongolian to Mongolian commanders, and Arabic to Islamic merchants, and Tibetan to Buddhist monks, and he had fought in a real battle, and he had kept tigers, and he had played music in the night, and he had run a market inside the most sacred building in China, because he wanted to know what markets felt like. The institution called this disorder, called it failure, called it a reign to be gotten through rather than celebrated. He called it being alive. The Ming historians recorded his flaws with meticulous, almost loving attention to detail. They wanted the record to be clear. They wanted posterity to understand that the Zhengde emperor had been a catastrophe, an aberration, an emperor who had failed to be what an emperor was supposed to be. And posterity read their records and understood, perhaps more than the historians intended, that the catastrophe they were describing was also a man, a young man, dead at 29, who had spent his entire adult life in the most golden cage ever constructed for a human being and had spent every day of those 16 years trying to find the door. He was the son of heaven who wanted to be human, and that desire they could never forgive. Here's a question that does not have a comfortable answer. If a man with no democratic mandate, no elected authority, and no legal right to govern pushes through the most progressive legislative reforms his country has ever seen, reforms that reduce suffering, expand freedom, and permanently improve the lives of ordinary people, does it matter how he got the power to do it? Does the good that comes from an illegitimate act become legitimate because it is good? And what happens when the man who made all of it possible, the man whose name was on every document, whose seal authorized every reform, whose crown gave the entire enterprise its legal existence? What happens when that man was not making decisions at all? When he was, in the most clinical and heartbreaking sense of the word, incapable of making decisions? When he was, in fact, sitting in a darkened room in a palace in Copenhagen, hearing voices, talking to imaginary companions, and drifting in and out of a reality that the people around him had largely stopped expecting him to inhabit? What do you call a revolution that was carried out in the name of a man who did not know it was happening? Denmark found out the answer in the years between 1770 and 1772. And the answer was so morally complicated, so historically consequential, and so deeply, uncomfortably human that it has never fully resolved itself into a clean story. It never will. To understand Christian VII, you have to begin not with the king, but with the child. Because the child is where the explanation lives. And because what was done to Christian before he was ever crowned is, in many ways, the most important thing that was ever done to him. Christian was born in January of 1749, the son of King Frederick V of Denmark. His mother, Queen Louise of Great Britain, died when he was 2 years old. His father, Frederick, was by most accounts a man of considerable personal charm and considerable personal weakness, devoted to drink and to pleasures that left him with limited attention for the small boy who had just lost his mother and had no one left to anchor him to the ordinary warmth of human affection. Into this vacancy stepped a man named Detlev Reventlow, Christian's tutor. And Reventlow was, by any reasonable assessment of the historical record, a man who caused serious, lasting, and deeply unnecessary damage to the child placed in his care. The educational philosophy Reventlow practiced was not unusual for its time, which is one of the more disturbing things about it. The prevailing wisdom of mid-18th century aristocratic education held that a prince required toughening, that softness was a danger and severity was a gift, that the way to produce a king was to subject the boy to the conditions that would strip away weakness and leave only strength behind. What this meant in practice for Christian was regular physical punishment for failures of performance. Beatings administered with a deliberateness that went well beyond any reasonable pedagogical purpose. It meant isolation from peers and from the kind of easy, unstructured human connection that children require in order to understand themselves as lovable, as safe, as possessed of inherent worth. It meant an environment where Christian's sense of his own value was systematically dismantled by the person who was supposed to be building it. The boy who emerged from this education was not strengthened. He was fractured. Contemporary accounts from Christian's adolescence describe a young man of evident intelligence. He was quick, curious, linguistically capable, but also erratic, prone to sudden violent outbursts followed by periods of withdrawal, given to behaviors that his court found baffling and concerning. He formed intense, inappropriate attachments to low-status companions, to a street acrobat named Moranti whom he elevated to an inexplicable position of personal favor, to various other individuals whose primary qualification for royal companionship appears to have been their willingness to engage with Christian in the rough, physical, boundary-free way that normal aristocratic court life did not permit. He was hungry for something that his entire existence had been structured to deny him. Contact. Real contact. The ordinary, unmediated, unsymbolic contact of one human being with another. Not a subject performing deference. Not a courtier performing loyalty. Not a tutor performing authority. Just a person present, without an agenda, willing to exist in the same space without requiring Christian to perform anything at all. He had been a king in training since before he could remember. He had never, even for a day, simply been a boy. He became king of Denmark in January of 1766, at the age of 16. His father Frederick had died, and Christian, ready or not, stable or not, by any clinical measure equipped for the role or not, was now the absolute monarch of Denmark, Norway, Schleswig, Holstein, and several other territories. He was, on paper, one of the more powerful rulers in Northern Europe. In practice, he was a 16-year-old with severe psychological damage, no genuine preparation for governance, no trusted adult in his life who had ever treated him with consistent warmth and absolute power over the lives of millions of people. The court around him did what courts do. It managed him. It created structures and routines and presentations that maintained the appearance of a functioning monarchy, while the actual work of governance was distributed among ministers, advisors, and the permanent bureaucratic apparatus that keeps states running regardless of the quality of the person nominally in charge. Christian performed when he could. He received ambassadors. He signed documents. He appeared at court functions with the practiced, slightly hollow formality of a man who's been told exactly what to do and is doing it correctly without understanding why. On his better days, he could be charming, even impressive. The intelligence his tutor had failed to destroy was still there, and it surfaced in conversation and in his evident intellectual curiosity about the world. On his worst days, he was somewhere else entirely. The voices, the visions, the periods of complete withdrawal from shared reality, these were not new. They had been there, in milder form, since childhood. But the pressures of kingship, the isolation of the throne, the weight of a role he had never been equipped to carry, these things did not stabilize what was already fragile. They accelerated its deterioration. By the time Christian had been king for 2 years, the question of what was actually happening inside the Danish monarchy was becoming impossible for the court to fully suppress. The king was unwell. The degree to which the king was unwell was a state secret of the first order, because a king known to be incapacitated was a king whose authority was instantly contestable, whose ministers became rivals, whose alliances became renegotiable, whose entire political position became vulnerable to the ambitions of the people surrounding him. Denmark needed its king to be a king. Denmark's king could barely manage to be a person. In 1768, a decision was made that would alter the entire trajectory of Danish history. Christian VII would go on a grand tour of Europe. The grand tour was the standard educational and diplomatic journey of 18th century aristocracy, a circuit through the major courts and cultural centers of the continent, designed to broaden the mind, cement alliances, and demonstrate to the assembled rulers of Europe that Denmark's young king was a serious and capable monarch. For Christian, it served an additional purpose that was less openly stated. It got him out of Copenhagen. away from the court factions that had been circling the empty center of his governance, away from the daily performance of kingship in its most demanding domestic form, into a different kind of space where the requirements were less grinding and the novelty of new places and new people might, his advisors hoped, have a stabilizing effect. It did not stabilize him, but it did something far more consequential. It introduced him to Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee was 31 years old when he joined the royal party in Altena, a Danish-controlled city near Hamburg, in the summer of 1768. He was a physician, educated in the most progressive medical tradition of his day, trained in the new scientific empiricism of the Enlightenment, deeply read in the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and the other great architects of 18th-century liberal thought. He was also, by all accounts, an exceptionally intelligent, personally charismatic, and politically shrewd man who recognized an extraordinary opportunity when it presented itself and moved toward it with a combination of genuine conviction and considerable personal ambition. He joined the tour as a doctor. He understood, quickly, how to make himself indispensable to a king who needed something that no one else in the royal entourage had thought to offer. He was kind, not sycophantically kind, not the performed deference of a courtier calculating his position. Genuinely, attentively, practically kind. He observed what Christian needed, the calm presence, the absence of demand, the willingness to simply be with the king without requiring the king to perform anything, and he provided it. He managed Christian's worst episodes with a clinical patience that kept them from becoming diplomatic catastrophes. He spoke to Christian as a person rather than as a symbol. He engaged the king's intelligence, which was real, on subjects that interested both of them. Christian, who had spent his entire life hungry for exactly this kind of undemanding human presence, responded to Struensee the way a man dying of thirst responds to water. By the time the royal party returned to Copenhagen in January of 1769, Struensee had become something that no physician in the history of the Danish court had ever become. He had become necessary. What followed over the next 3 years was one of the most audacious accumulations of unauthorized political power in European history. Struensee began, reasonably enough, as the king's personal physician, but his access to Christian, daily, intimate, unrestricted, gave him an influence over the king that no minister or advisor could match. And as Christian's condition continued to deteriorate in the months following the Grand Tour, as the gap between the king who was supposed to be governing and the man who was actually present in the royal apartments widened into something that could no longer be managed by normal court procedure, Struensee moved into that gap. He began drafting documents for the king to sign. This was not, in itself, unusual. Ministers drafted documents for monarchs routinely. But the documents Struensee drafted were not the routine business of the Danish state. They were the legislative program of an Enlightenment philosopher who had spent years thinking about what a truly rational, humane system of governance would look like, and who now, astonishingly, improbably, impossibly, had the legal mechanism to actually build it. He established his formal position in the court in stages. First as a privy councillor, then, in September of 1770, in a move of breathtaking audacity, he had Christian sign a cabinet order granting Struensee the authority to issue royal orders directly, without countersignature from any minister. The order was in the king's name. The power was Struensee's, and then he legislated. In the 16 months between September of 1770 and January of 1772, Johann Friedrich Struensee issued approximately 1,800 cabinet orders in the name of Christian VII of Denmark. 1,800. The scope of what Struensee attempted in those 16 months is difficult to fully convey without losing the reader in a list of legislative achievements. But the list matters because it is the argument. It is the evidence for the extraordinary, morally complicated claim at the center of this chapter. He abolished censorship of the press, one of the first absolute monarchies in Europe to do so, creating a freedom of expression that immediately produced a torrent of pamphlets, newspapers, and political commentary that had previously been entirely suppressed. He reformed the criminal justice system. introducing principles of proportionality in sentencing and limiting the application of the most brutal physical punishments that Danish law had previously sanctioned. He outlawed torture as a tool of judicial investigation. He abolished the practice of serfdom in certain territories, beginning the process of dismantling the feudal labor arrangements that had kept Danish and Norwegian peasants in conditions of practical bondage for generations. He established public hospitals and improved the medical infrastructure available to ordinary citizens, including, notably, the first public maternity care institution in Danish history, which directly and immediately reduced the deaths of mothers and infants among the urban poor. He introduced a formal system of religious toleration, reducing the legal penalties for religious nonconformity in a society that had previously demanded Lutheran orthodoxy as a condition of full civic participation. He reformed the public finances, cutting court expenditures and attempting to redirect royal resources toward public purposes, an act that made him enemies among the nobility whose sinecures and pensions he targeted, but that represented a genuinely principled application of Enlightenment economics. He streamlined the bureaucracy, eliminating redundant offices and the culture of fee extraction that had made Danish administration both expensive and corrupt. He proposed educational reforms. He addressed poor relief. He restructured the military administration. Each of these measures, individually, represented a significant reform. Together, they constituted the most comprehensive program of Enlightenment governance ever attempted in an absolute monarchy in such a compressed period of time. And every single one of them was issued in the name of a king who, during some portion of the time they were being drafted, did not fully understand where he was. There was, of course, the other dimension of Struensee's position at the Danish court, the dimension that his enemies used most effectively and that history has found most difficult to evaluate with clear eyes. His relationship with Queen Caroline Mathilde. Caroline Mathilde was English, the youngest sister of King George III of Great Britain. She had married Christian at 15, arrived in Copenhagen knowing almost no Danish, and found herself in a court that was simultaneously dominated by a husband who could not consistently recognize her as his wife and by the complex political machinery of a court that had no particular interest in her welfare. She was lonely, isolated, and young in a foreign country, married to a man whose illness made any normal marital relationship essentially impossible. Struensee, who was present daily, who was intelligent and warm and possessed of the kind of confident intellectual vitality that the Danish court otherwise entirely lacked, became her companion, then her advisor, then her lover. Their relationship was an open secret in Copenhagen within months of its beginning. It was also, by any formal legal standard, adultery with the Queen of Denmark, a crime that carried its own specific weight of political dynamite in a monarchical system where the legitimacy of the royal succession depended, in theory, on the unquestioned paternity of the royal children. Caroline Mathilde gave birth to a daughter, Louise Augusta, in July of 1771. The question of that child's paternity was never formally resolved and has not been definitively resolved since. It did not need to be. The court that despised Struensee had the weapon it needed. The coalition that moved against Struensee in January of 1772 was not motivated primarily by moral outrage, though moral outrage was the language it used most fluently. It was motivated by interest. The men who destroyed Struensee, led primarily by the Dowager Queen Juliane Marie, who had never forgiven him for displacing her political influence over her stepson, and by Ove Goldberg, a deeply conservative courtier who understood exactly what Struensee's reforms represented for the traditional order, were not reformers who objected to his methods while admiring his goals. They were conservatives who objected to his goals and used his methods as the most convenient instrument of destruction. On the night of January the 16th, 1772, the conspirators moved. They obtained an audience with Christian, one of his more lucid evenings by the accounts that survived, and presented him with documents accusing Struensee and Caroline Mathilde of treason and adultery. Christian, confused by what was being asked of him, and influenced by the figures around him with a suggestibility that characterized his worst periods, signed the orders for their arrest. Struensee was taken from his bed in the early hours of January the 17th. He was arrested, imprisoned, tried, and subjected to the kind of judicial process that his own reforms had been designed to prevent. Coercive, shaped by predetermined conclusions, conducted by men whose interest in the outcome made a fair proceeding structurally impossible. He was convicted of crimes against the royal majesty. He was sentenced to death. On April the 28th, 1772, Johann Friedrich Struensee was executed in Copenhagen. He was 38 years old. In his final weeks, he had undergone a genuine religious conversion, documented in writing that has survived and that most historians consider authentic, that gave him, apparently, a degree of peace that the circumstances of his life and death might have seemed to preclude. Caroline Mathilde was spared execution. Her brother, King George III of Britain, made clear that the execution of an English princess would have serious diplomatic consequences. She was divorced from Christian and exiled to the castle of Celle in the German Principality of Hanover, where she died 3 years later at the age of 23. Christian VII did not attend the execution. He may not have fully understood what was happening. In the immediate aftermath of Struensee's execution, the new government of Goldberg and Julien Marie moved quickly to dismantle the most visible of his reforms. The press freedom that had produced 16 months of vigorous public commentary was curtailed again. Some of the financial reforms were reversed. The bureaucratic reconstruction was partially undone. The conservative court that had suffered the indignity of being governed by a German doctor's intellectual ambitions made clear, in every institutional act of the following years, that the Struensee episode was to be understood as an aberration, a usurpation, a crime, a catastrophe that proper governance had corrected. But they could not undo everything. The public maternity hospitals remained. The reform of judicial torture, the prohibition against its use as a tool of investigation, survived in substantial form. The momentum toward religious tolerance, though temporarily slowed, could not be entirely reversed in a European intellectual climate that was moving decisively in the direction of Enlightenment values. The serf reforms, partial as they were, remained in the public conversation and continued to develop under subsequent governments. And perhaps most significantly, the demonstration itself remained. The demonstration that these things were possible, that an absolute monarchy could abolish press censorship and it would not immediately collapse, that you could restrict judicial torture and the criminal justice system would continue to function, that public health institutions could be built and maintained, that religious tolerance could be legislated and society would not disintegrate. Struensee had run an experiment. His enemies had shut it down before it was complete, but they could not unrun it. The data existed. The precedent existed. The knowledge that these reforms were achievable in this political system, in this cultural context, was now part of the Danish political imagination in a way that it had not been before 1770. The reformers who came after Struensee, and they came with increasing confidence and increasing success across the following decades, did not operate in his shadow. They operated in his light. They knew what was possible because they had seen it done. Not fully, not sustainably, not through legitimate means, but done. Denmark did not become a progressive nation in 16 months. It became one across a century and a half of gradual, contested, sometimes painful legislative evolution. But the arc of that evolution, the specific direction it took, the particular character of the reforms it prioritized, bears the unmistakable imprint of those 16 months when a doctor ran the country in the name of a king who could barely remember his own name. And what of Christian VII? He continued to reign. In name, in law, in the technical constitutional sense, he remained king of Denmark until his death in 1808, a reign of 42 years, making him one of the longer-serving monarchs in Danish history, which is one of those historical ironies that feels like it should be impossible. He was managed, after Struensee's fall, with somewhat more care and somewhat less exploitation than he had been before. The Goldberg regime, for all its conservatism, understood that a visibly incapacitated king was a political liability and made more effort to keep Christian functional enough to perform the minimum requirements of his role. When his son Frederick was old enough, effective power passed to the crown prince, and Christian was allowed to recede from governance into a gentler obscurity. He had moments of lucidity across the decades of his long reign. He had moments of warmth and intelligence that remind you, painfully, of what might have been possible if the child had been protected rather than broken, if the system had been designed around his humanity rather than his function. There's a record of him, in his later years, being kind to servants, interested in music, capable of brief, genuine connection. He died in February of 1808, at the age of 59. He had been king since 16. He had never, in any real sense, been allowed to be well. The moral reckoning with the Struensee episode does not produce clean conclusions, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Struensee was not a simple hero. He was a complicated man who used a mentally ill person's incapacity to accumulate power that no individual in a functioning political system should possess, and who deployed that power, however wisely, however progressively, without any form of democratic accountability or public consent. The good he did was real. The means by which he did it were a form of theft. These two things are simultaneously true, and they do not cancel each other out. Christian VII was not simply a victim. He was a person of genuine, demonstrable intelligence who was failed at every stage of his development by the people who were supposed to protect him, by his tutor, by his father, by a court more interested in the symbol of the king than in the well-being of the man wearing the crown. He was failed in a different way by Struensee, who found in Christian's incapacity an opportunity rather than a responsibility. And he was failed by the conspirators who used his illness as a weapon to destroy a man and reverse reforms that his people needed. He was, across 4 decades of reign, the most exploited person in Denmark. And yet, from the wreckage of his exploitation, from the specific, improbable, morally tangled chain of events that his illness set in motion, came a contribution to Danish civic life that outlasted everyone who used him. The reforms that Struensee built on the foundation of Christian's incapacity were imperfect, partial, and achieved through means that no democratic conscience can fully endorse. But they were also real, and their reality mattered. Denmark today is, by almost every measure of human development, one of the most successful societies on earth. Its press freedom, its criminal justice system, its public health infrastructure, its religious tolerance, its commitment to the welfare of ordinary citizens. These things were not created in 1771. They were built over generations, by many hands, through many arguments and many struggles. But somewhere in the foundation, if you dig deep enough, you find 16 months of extraordinary legislative activity carried out by a man with no right to do it, in the name of a king with no capacity to authorize it. And somewhere beneath that, you find a child who was hurt when he should have been loved, who was broken when he should have been built, who sat on the most powerful throne in Northern Europe for 42 years and never once had the chance to simply be well. That child's suffering was not redemptive. It was not necessary. It was not the price that had to be paid for Denmark's eventual flourishing. It was simply what happened to a boy that the world failed. What emerged from that failure was not because of the failure. It was in spite of it. They executed the doctor, but you cannot execute an idea whose time has come. There's a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who can see something so clearly, so completely, and so beautifully that the effort of explaining it to anyone else feels, from the very beginning, like a defeat. Not arrogance, not madness, not the grandiose detachment of a man who has confused his own imagination with reality. Just the quiet, aching isolation of a person whose inner world is so vivid, so fully realized, so achingly present to him that the ordinary world, the world of budgets and borders and political alliances and the grinding daily machinery of governance, feels not merely dull, but genuinely, viscerally painful to inhabit. Most people who feel this way become artists, or musicians, or they disappear into private life and build their inner world in whatever modest space the world allows them. Ludwig II of Bavaria had the extraordinary misfortune of feeling this way while also being a king. And he did what kings do when they want something. He built it. What he built, at a cost that nearly bankrupted his government, in locations so remote they seemed to exist outside ordinary geography, with a level of personal obsessive detail that defied every convention of royal patronage, turned out to be the most economically productive act of governance in the history of his kingdom. But he never knew that. He was dead before anyone thought to charge admission. To understand Ludwig II, you need to understand the world he was born into and the world he was born longing for. He came into the world in August of 1845, the eldest son of King Maximilian II of Bavaria and Queen Marie of Prussia. Bavaria, in the mid-19th century, was not a great power. It was a medium-sized German kingdom, culturally sophisticated, historically proud, but increasingly squeezed between the rising industrial and military ambitions of Prussia to the north and Austria to the east. The German-speaking world was in the process of a profound and often violent reorganization, and Bavaria's future as an independent kingdom was, though few wish to say so plainly, genuinely uncertain. This was the political reality of Ludwig's inheritance. Ludwig's interior reality was something else entirely. He was a boy of exceptional physical beauty. Contemporary accounts are almost unanimous on this point, and the photographs and portraits of his youth confirm it. Tall, dark-haired, with features of almost classical regularity and eyes of an unusual pale blue that observers consistently described as simultaneously striking and somehow distant. He was also, from his earliest years, a boy of extraordinary imaginative intensity. He read voraciously, not the political philosophy and military history that a crown prince was expected to master, but poetry, medieval romance, the great mythological cycles of Germanic tradition. He was transfixed by the legend of the Swan Knight, Lohengrin, the pure, otherworldly knight who comes from the realm of the Grail to save a princess and then departs, unable to remain in an impure world when his divine origins are revealed. He was, in other words, a romantic, in the deep 19th century meaning of that word, a person for whom beauty was not decorative but essential, for whom myth was not entertainment but meaning, for whom the ideal was more real and more important than the actual. The actual world of mid-19th century Bavaria, its politics, its bureaucracy, its wars, its compromises, was to Ludwig a kind of exile. The world he belonged to was elsewhere, in the Middle Ages that he read about in his illuminated manuscripts, in the operas that would soon become the organizing passion of his life, in the castles and forests and mountain lakes of his Bavarian homeland, which, in a certain quality of light, at a certain hour of the morning, before the administrators arrived with their papers, looked like somewhere a Swan Knight might actually live. He became king at 18, and everything got harder. In May of 1864, Maximilian II died unexpectedly, and Ludwig, who was not yet 19 years old and was by no accounts prepared for what was about to happen to him, became King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The timing was, from a purely political standpoint, catastrophic. Bavaria was about to be dragged into two wars in 2 years. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, in which Bavaria sided with Austria and was comprehensively defeated by Prussia in a matter of weeks, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, in which Bavaria fought alongside Prussia against France and emerged on the winning side, but at the price of something Bavaria had never been willing to surrender: its independence. In January of 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, a location chosen with an irony so heavy it is almost architectural, the German Empire was proclaimed. The German-speaking kingdoms and principalities of Central Europe were unified under Prussian leadership. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Prussia became the Emperor of Germany, and Ludwig II of Bavaria, who had spent 1866 trying to stay out of Prussia's war and 1870 through 71 fighting in it, was now a monarch of a kingdom that was technically sovereign but practically, in every matter of military and foreign policy, subordinate to Berlin. Bavaria still existed. Ludwig was still a king. But the kingdom he governed was now a component of a larger German whole, with a Prussian emperor above it and a Prussian general staff directing the military forces that Bavaria was legally obligated to contribute. A man who had always found the ordinary work of governance painful now found himself governing a kingdom that was itself in the process of being absorbed into something larger than itself. The political entity whose head he was had become, in a very real sense, as much a performance as the operas he loved. He responded in the only way that was, for him, natural. He retreated, not from kingship entirely. He continued to sign documents, receive ministers, perform the minimum functions of royal governance. But from the expectation that he would be a modern political monarch in any active sense, he withdrew with a decisiveness that his court found alarming and that he found one's suspects simply honest. He was not the king Bavaria needed for the political moment it was in. He knew it. His ministers knew it. The court knew it. And Ludwig, with something that looked from outside like abdication, but felt from inside like self-preservation, went to the mountains. There was one other development in the first year of Ludwig's reign that shaped everything that followed. One introduction, one relationship, one encounter that set the entire trajectory of his life and his legacy in a direction that no one, including Ludwig himself, could fully have anticipated. He discovered Richard Wagner. Wagner was 50 years old in 1864. He was also broke, in debt, pursued by creditors across Europe, and in the process of composing what he intended to be the most ambitious cycle of musical dramas in the history of Western art. The Ring of the Nibelung, a four-opera sequence based on Germanic myth that required an orchestra of extraordinary size, a performance venue that did not yet exist, and a level of financial support that no private patron had yet been willing or able to provide. Ludwig had encountered Wagner's music before his coronation. The opera Lohengrin, the legend of the Swan Knight that had haunted Ludwig's imagination since childhood, had been set to music by Wagner, and the young Ludwig had found in the combination of the myth he loved and the music Wagner had written for it something that felt less like entertainment and more like revelation. When he became king, one of his first acts was to find Wagner and bring him to Munich. Wagner came. He was a difficult man, vain, demanding, politically indiscreet, personally extravagant, and possessed of a genius so large and so certain of itself that it did not particularly encourage the kind of mutual respect that healthy relationships require. He was also, in his artistic vision and his understanding of what music and myth could do together in the human imagination, something close to what Ludwig believed him to be. He was transcendent. Ludwig funded Wagner's work with a generosity that his treasury ministers found alarming and that Wagner accepted with a sense of entitlement that even his admirers found remarkable. He paid Wagner's debts. He provided him with a villa, a stipend, and access to court musicians. He planned the construction of a festival theater in Munich specifically designed for Wagner's operas, a theater whose acoustic and spatial requirements were, like everything Wagner conceived, significantly ahead of anything that then existed. The Munich court hated Wagner almost immediately. He was arrogant. He was visibly exploiting the king's devotion. He interfered in politics in ways that his status as a foreign artist made deeply inappropriate. He had a relationship with Cosima, the wife of the conductor Hans von Bülow, a relationship that would eventually produce 3 children and, still later, a marriage that the court found scandalous. They pressured Ludwig to dismiss Wagner from Munich. Ludwig, after considerable resistance and considerable personal anguish, eventually agreed. Wagner left Munich in December of 1865 and did not return as a resident. But Ludwig continued to fund him, continued to correspond with him. A correspondence of extraordinary intensity and emotional depth, letters that read like the private language of 2 people who have agreed to conduct their relationship entirely in the realm of the ideal because the actual has failed them both. He funded the construction of the Bayreuth Festival Theater in the Bavarian town of Bayreuth, which Wagner chose as his permanent base, where the Ring cycle was finally performed in 1876, 32 years after Wagner had begun composing it, in a theater that would not have existed without Ludwig's money and that remains, to this day, the center of the Wagner world. Ludwig attended the premiere of The Ring at Bayreuth. He arrived at night, in a private carriage, to avoid the crowds. He sat in the royal box and heard the music he had been funding for 12 years finally pour out into the hall that his patronage had built. He wept. Whether those were tears of joy or something more complicated, the melancholy of a man who has finally gotten what he wanted and finds that wanting it was, in some ways, better than having it. The accounts do not record clearly enough to say. Wagner died in February of 1883 in Venice. Ludwig received the news at his castle in the Bavarian Alps. He had lost the person whose inner world most closely approximated his own. The person for whom the ideal was also more real than the actual. The person who, unlike almost everyone else in Ludwig's life, had never required him to explain why beauty mattered. After Wagner's death, Ludwig retreated further. Into his mountains, into his castles, into the specific, private, architecturally realized version of the world that only he could fully inhabit. The castles. We need to talk about the castles. Not as a travel writer talks about them, not as a tourist board describes them, but as the autobiography they actually are, the most expensive, most detailed, most structurally ambitious self-portrait ever constructed by a human being who happened to have access to a royal treasury. There were 3 major castles, each one different, each one a different room in the same impossible interior. Neuschwanstein came first in the public imagination, though not in the construction sequence. And it remains the image that the entire world reaches for when it tries to picture what Ludwig was. It sits on a rocky promontory in the Bavarian Alps, at an elevation that places it above the Treeline in winter, its white limestone towers rising against the mountain backdrop in a way that seems to violate the normal relationship between human construction and natural landscape. It was begun in 1869 and was never fully completed. Ludwig lived in it for only 172 days before his death. It was designed not by a conventional architect, but by a theatrical set designer named Christian Jank, which tells you almost everything you need to know about what Ludwig was building. He was not building a palace. He was building a stage set for a life he intended to live. The interior of Neuschwanstein is a sustained meditation on Wagner's operas and the medieval German myths they drew from. The Singers' Hall, a room designed for performances of Wagnerian opera that was never actually used for one during Ludwig's lifetime, occupies an entire floor and is painted with scenes from the legend of Parsifal. The throne room has no throne. The platform is there, the canopy is there, the Byzantine splendor of gold and lapis and column is there, but the throne itself was never installed. A room designed around the idea of royal authority, in which the symbol of that authority is conspicuously absent. It is, when you know the story, one of the most precise architectural statements anyone has ever made about their own relationship to power. Linderhof was smaller, intimate by the standards of royal construction, a palace rather than a castle, built in the French Rococo style, set in a valley in the Bavarian Alps with formal gardens, a cascade, and a grotto that Ludwig had built to recreate the Blue Grotto of Capri, where he would float in a small boat lit by colored electrical lights. One of the first uses of electric light in a royal residence in Europe. Listening to music and reading poetry in a solitude so complete that he had timed his daily. Scheduled to avoid almost all contact with other people. He dined alone, setting tables for imaginary historical companions. For Louis XIV of France, whose version of absolute monarchy Ludwig found fascinating precisely because it was so remote from anything he himself was capable of. Herrenchiemsee was the most ambitious. Built on an island in a Bavarian lake, intended as a tribute to the Palace of Versailles. Not a copy, Ludwig insisted, but a statement that Bavaria's artistic culture deserved to stand alongside anything France had ever produced. The Hall of Mirrors at Herrenchiemsee is longer than the one at Versailles. Ludwig slept there 17 nights. The castle was never completed. 80 rooms were planned. 20 were finished. Together, the 3 castles cost approximately 6 million guilders, an astronomical sum that the Bavarian treasury was not designed to absorb, and that Ludwig, whose relationship with financial reality was as idealistic as his relationship with every other kind of reality, funded through a combination of royal income, personal loans, and increasingly desperate borrowing from sources that his ministers found alarming. By 1886, Ludwig's personal debt had reached 14 million marks. His creditors were threatening legal action. His ministers were threatening something more immediate. The conspiracy against Ludwig II of Bavaria was dressed with considerable care in the language of medicine. His ministers, led by Johann Lutz, the head of the Bavarian government, and supported by the broader conservative establishment that had grown exhausted and alarmed by a decade of royal inaccessibility, financial disorder, and increasingly erratic personal behavior, decided that the most effective way to remove Ludwig from power was not through any of the conventional mechanisms of political accountability, which the Bavarian constitution did not well provide for in this situation. It was to declare him insane, legally incapacitated, permanently unfit to govern, unable, by virtue of mental illness, to exercise the royal authority that the Constitution vested in him. This declaration required medical authority. And so, in the late spring of 1886, a panel of 4 psychiatrists was assembled to assess the king's mental condition and produce a formal medical opinion on his fitness to rule. The panel was led by Dr. Bernhard von Gutten, the director of the Upper Bavaria District Lunatic Asylum, a man of genuine professional distinction and considerable reputation in the emerging field of psychiatric medicine. The report that von Gutten and his colleagues produced in June of 1886 concluded that Ludwig suffered from a form of paranoia that rendered him permanently and irrecoverably mentally incompetent. Not one of the 4 psychiatrists had examined Ludwig in person. Not one of them had spoken to him, observed him, conducted any direct clinical assessment of any kind. The report was based entirely on second-hand testimony, from servants, from dismissed officials, from people whose accounts of the king's behavior were filtered through their own interests, their own grievances, and their own very imperfect understanding of what they had observed. Some of the testimony used to construct the diagnosis described behaviors that, while certainly unusual, were not self-evidently symptoms of the condition being diagnosed. Others described events that could not be independently verified. The report declared Ludwig permanently insane on the basis of evidence that no court of serious scientific inquiry, then or now, would accept as adequate for so grave a conclusion. It was not a medical finding. It was a political instrument wearing a doctor's coat. On June 10th, 1886, Ludwig II was formally deposed. A government commission traveled to Neuschwanstein to deliver the news and escort him from his castle. Ludwig was devastated. He spoke of suicide. He was prevented from acting on it by the people around him. He wept. He was taken to the Palace of Berg on the shores of Lake Starnberg, south of Munich, to be held under what was officially described as medical supervision. Dr. von Gutten accompanied him. On the evening of June 13th, 1886, Ludwig and Dr. von Gutten went for a walk along the shore of Lake Starnberg. They were accompanied by attendants who, at some point during the walk, fell back or were dismissed. What happened next has never been conclusively established. Their bodies were found in the shallow waters of the lake later that evening. Ludwig was dead. Von Gutten was dead. The official verdict was drowning. Specifically, that the king had drowned himself and that von Gutten, attempting to prevent him, had been drowned in the struggle. But the circumstances have never fully supported this narrative, and they still do not. The water where the bodies were found was shallow enough to stand in. Ludwig was known to be a strong swimmer. Von Gutten showed signs of physical violence that drowning alone does not explain. No definitive alternative explanation has ever been established. No court has ever formally adjudicated the question of what happened on the shores of Lake Starnberg on the evening of June 13th, 1886. Ludwig II of Bavaria was 68 days short of his 41st birthday. The government that had declared him insane and deposed him moved, with a speed that was itself informative, to open his castles to the public. 7 weeks after his death, Neuschwanstein received its first paying visitors. There's a word for what happened next, but it requires numbers, and the numbers are so large that they become almost abstract. Neuschwanstein today receives approximately 1.4 million visitors every year. In the peak summer months, the castle processes up to 6,000 people per day. Visitors who come from every country on Earth, who wait in lines that stretch down the mountain road, who book tickets months in advance, who buy the photographs and the keychains and the illustrated books and the porcelain replicas, and who leave behind an economic contribution to the region of Bavaria that, across the century and a half since the castle opened to the public, amounts to a figure so large as to have permanently transformed the economic character of the surrounding landscape. Linderhof receives more than 300,000 visitors annually. Herrenchiemsee Sea, accessible only by boat, draws hundreds of thousands more. The region of the Bavarian Alps, the Allgäu, the area around the Starnberger Sea, the Chiemsee, has an international tourism industry that is built in direct and measurable proportion on the castles that Ludwig built. Hotels, restaurants, transport infrastructure, regional employment across several generations of Bavarian families, all of it resting, to a degree that economists have studied and documented, on the choices that a lonely, music-obsessed, mythologically transfixed king made in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s about where to build his dreams. But the legacy of Ludwig II extends well beyond the economics of Bavarian tourism. There is a castle in Anaheim, California. It was built in 1955 by a man named Walt Disney, who wanted an image of a castle for the entrance to his new theme park that would communicate instantly and universally the idea of fairy tale, of enchantment, of a world where the magical is not merely possible, but structurally present in the architecture. He looked at Neuschwanstein, the Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland, and its successors in Disney theme parks on 4 continents, is the most directly recognized castle image on Earth. It appears in the opening sequence of every Disney film. It is, in a very literal sense, the visual symbol of imagination itself for hundreds of millions of people across the world. Its template was a castle built by a man his own government declared insane. And beyond Disney, the influence of Ludwig's patronage of Wagner is not a footnote. It is a chapter in the history of Western music. The Bayreuth Festival, which Ludwig funded and which continues to operate every summer in the theater his money built, has been the most important venue for the performance and study of Wagner's work for 150 years. Conductors, singers, composers, and musical thinkers who shaped the entire trajectory of 20th century Western music passed through Bayreuth. The influence of Wagner's work, which would not have been completed without Ludwig's money, and might never have been performed in the form Wagner intended without the theater Ludwig funded, runs through the music of the 20th century in ways that are difficult to fully trace precisely because they are so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of what Western music became. Ludwig did not intend to build a tourism industry. He did not intend to create the visual template for the world's most recognizable castle. He did not intend to secure the completion and performance of the most ambitious operatic cycle in Western history. He intended to build somewhere to live that felt like home. The fact that home for Ludwig II looked like a medieval castle on a mountain crag lit by electric light with a throne room that had no throne. The fact that his version of home was so singular, so architecturally realized, so magnificently and tragically specific to one person's interior world, is not a symptom of madness. It is a portrait, the most expensive, most elaborate, most structurally permanent self-portrait in the history of a civilization that has produced a great many self-portraits. There are questions about Ludwig II that history asks and cannot fully answer. Was he mentally ill in any clinically meaningful sense? Almost certainly, in some degree. The accounts of his later years describe behaviors, extreme nocturnal schedules, near total social withdrawal, a relationship with reality that had become increasingly governed by the mythological and symbolic framework of his imagination rather than by practical necessity, that suggest a mind under significant stress, possibly experiencing symptoms that a modern clinician would want to evaluate carefully. but mentally ill in the sense the psychiatric report of 1886 claimed, permanently and irrecoverably insane, incapable of exercising any judgment at all. The evidence, assessed honestly, does not support that conclusion. The report's authors knew this. They did not care. They had a political objective, and they used the language of medicine to achieve it, because it was the most effective instrument available. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Ludwig's story. Not that he was sane in some simple sense that his enemies were too foolish to recognize, but that the category of sanity was weaponized against him by people whose primary objection to his governance was not his mental health. It was his spending, his inaccessibility, his refusal to be the kind of modern, politically engaged, diplomatically useful monarch that the new German Empire required its component kings to be. He was inconvenient, and in the political vocabulary of 1886 Bavaria, inconvenient was translated, through 4 psychiatrists who asked him no questions, into insane. The distinction matters enormously, not just for Ludwig, but for what the distinction tells us about how power protects itself from challenge. Declaring a king mad is, historically, one of the cleanest ways to dispose of him. It requires no accusation of crime. It requires no trial with the attendant risk of acquittal. It requires no public debate about the merits of the governance being removed. It simply requires a medical opinion that places the subject outside the category of persons capable of exercising legitimate authority. And if the medical opinion is produced by people with interests in its conclusions, on the basis of testimony gathered by people with interests in its conclusions, reviewed by no independent authority, and challenged by no one with the legal standing to challenge it, well, then a man can be declared insane because it is useful for him to be declared insane. And the following morning, he can be found dead in a lake. And the question of how he got there can remain officially unresolved for 140 years. Ludwig II of Bavaria deserved better than what he got. Not because he was a perfect king or a conventionally successful one, or a man without serious personal struggles. He was none of those things. He was a person of profound artistic vision and genuine personal fragility, who found himself installed at the head of a political institution that required things he was not equipped to provide, and who responded by building, with extraordinary dedication, a world that made sense to him. The world he built turned out to make sense to a great many other people as well. The government that declared him mad charged admission to his castles within 2 months of his death. The economy of the region he governed has been drawing on those castles for 140 years. The musical tradition he funded has shaped Western culture in ways that will outlast everything his ministers built. He was not forgotten. His government tried to reduce him to a medical category and file him away. Instead, he became Bavaria's most recognized export. History tried to make Ludwig a cautionary tale. He became a destination. There is something in the last days of Ludwig II, something in the image of that tall, pale-eyed, physically magnificent man standing on the balcony of Neuschwanstein on the night before the commission arrived to take him away, looking out over the Bavarian Alps at the landscape he had tried to render permanent in stone, that resists the comfortable narrative of madness and its consequences. He was not a man who had lost touch with beauty. He was a man who had never been able to make his peace with anything else. The world he was born into, the world of German unification, of Bismarckian realpolitik, of industrial capitalism and modern warfare, and the relentless administrative machinery of the 19th century nation-state, was not a world that had much use for a king who cared about Wagner and medieval myth and the precise shade of blue that the grotto at Linderhof turned when you lit it with electrical current at midnight. That world wanted a modern monarch. It got, instead, a poet with a treasury. The poet built things that outlasted everyone who wanted him to be something else. They called him mad for building castles in the clouds. Then they charged admission. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the kings who got left out of the textbooks and the rulers who remade the world without meaning to, then consider leaving a like on this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to go deeper, if you want more of this kind of history, told the way history deserves to be told, as a human story first and a political one second. Then subscribe. There are more stories where these came from. Stories that history buried and that deserve very badly to be told. We will tell them.